this up and going. All right. Hey, Kyle, can you hear me? Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Oh, maybe not. All right. We should get started. I've got a few things I need to chat about before we get started this morning. Let's share this with the Zoom people. All right. Let's see if we can. The computer's been moved and it's driving. Awesome. It's driving me insane this morning. So you all on Zoom won't be able to see that, but we'll have to work with it being slightly different this morning. Okay. All right, so here we are. So we are week 15, chapter 11. We're going to talk about a couple of things that we need to get done. So the first one is today we're going to talk about the plague, and on Friday we're going to talk about the Reformation. Okay, we'll go over these topics because they're on the Unit 4 exam, and I need you to know those things. If you want to, I'm going to try and provide some context, but really the best bet is that you've done the reading so that you can understand how these things fit into everything else that we've been talking about. Let's go over a couple of other things though before we get started there. Yep, that's what I want. Okay. First, if you have not enrolled in spring classes, do so. Okay. We want to make sure that we know what classes are going to run and what classes are not. Generally, we have most students wait till Christmas break to sign up. Okay, and that's nothing new. But this semester looks different, and we're down in enrollment in our spring classes, and so it looks like that people maybe are either worried about coming to class and wearing a mask, or are worried about COVID, and so they're not certain, and so they're not signing up. The biggest thing is that we don't know what classes are going to run then. This is always unfortunate when you have several people who are like, well, right, I signed up for this really cool class that I want to take, and then come spring, right, come January, it's not running, and we have to cancel that class and move those students around and whatever that might be. Okay. So if there is a class that you really want to take, get signed up for it, get other people in it. There generally has to be at least 8 people for that course to run. So if there's something that you wanted to take, I would suggest getting your friends in that class, whatever it takes, but enrollment. Okay. If you're on campus, you'll see signs that we posted for enrollment, enroll for spring. So with that being said, I teach in the spring always 2 online courses. Those 2 online courses is the second half of this, so History 102, and then US History 112. Both of those classes will be online. They are exactly like this class. Okay, so if you have been nervous about taking an online course, once you've been through this class, honestly, it's all the same. It's exactly the same. There are weekly videos that I post. There are interactions but basically it's the exact same thing. And so it might be a way to try an online course if you haven't yet, and to do it that way. I am going to tell you that my US history 112 is probably the best class that I do, only because that's my area of expertise, and we spend a lot of time, um, I don't know, listening to music and podcasts and different things like that. So, um, artifact analysis, where you look at uh, political cartoons and stuff like that. So, anyway, if you're interested, I would I would sign up. Uh, I think the one class is almost full. So, and I don't remember which one it is. I looked at them yesterday, but I don't remember which one has is almost the limit. But anyway, if you really want to take one from me, let me know. I could let you in. I don't think that's a big deal either. So, uh, there was another piece. Oh, evaluations. Make sure that you get on and do evaluations for this course, for all of your courses. I was just trying to find it. I only do it once a semester, and every time I have to go and find it. So don't ask me now how to do evaluations. I will figure that out, and I'll let you know by Friday. But if you know how to do it, then just do it. Go on and do it. Okay. So evaluations, student evaluations, get on, or course evaluations, get on and do that. Also, I don't know if any of you all saw two pieces. Any of you all saw this, but a new discovery in Russia, where there is a hut made of mammoth bones. Like 65 different mammoths took made up this hut, and they have no idea, like, where did the mammoths come from, right? Like, were there that many mammoths coming through, or was this did they have to bring the bones to this spot to make this hut? Anyway, it's like boggling historians and archaeologists' minds right now of how that many mammoth bones got to this place. Okay, and it's a hut. It looks like a hut. I mean, mammoth bones going up, leather over the top of it, kind of holding them together. Obviously, that's not how it looks right now. It's all in the ground and a bunch of bones scattered, but that's what it would have looked like. The other thing coming out earlier this week is that uh, historians believe that they found the actual house of Jesus, which I find fascinating. And I realize that I geek out about this stuff, but honestly, like, that is fascinating. If they have, there is like a museum. It used to be a convent, but a museum around uh, this area in Nazareth, and so they've thought a lot. They believe that that's around where Jesus was born, but now they've gotten down to the time period that it would have been, and they're finding stones. I should have brought the picture, but they've got stones, and it looks like a little house. Anyway, fascinating, and that is, I'm fascinated by that stuff. You all don't have to be fascinated by that stuff, but anyway, that's what I find it fascinating, and it goes back to this whole idea, right? That history is always changing, and people like to tell me that it can't change. Specifically, my mother is always like, nope, that's not the way it works. It doesn't change. It does change. History changes. And the reason it changes is because, yeah, there's tons of facts, but then we find new artifacts uh, that maybe skew those facts or disprove some of those facts or whatever it might be. So it's always evolving. Anyway. All right. Those were the major pieces that I want to talk to you about this morning. Let me see if I can turn this camera so I can sit here and talk to you all too. Okay, we're going to talk about the plague today. I think that that will take up all of our time, and then we will talk about the Reformation on Friday. Oh, next week, one last thing. Next week, I had told you that we were going to review on Monday and Wednesday. The exam is already open on Wednesday. Okay. I just yesterday had a meeting scheduled. I have to be to a meeting on Wednesday morning and will not be able to be in class next Wednesday. So we will not have class on Wednesday. I think because it's the final, it's probably best if we do review then Monday and Friday. if you want to take the exam on Wednesday, show up to class on Monday. And I'll say this again on Friday. If you want to take the exam on Wednesday and you want the review, show up on Monday. If you're like, nope, I'm going to leave it till the weekend, show up on Friday and we can review on Friday. And then that'll be the last class that we meet. Okay. So we will be here next week, Monday and Friday. That is not how I told the class on Monday, right? On Monday, I said that we'd be here Monday and Wednesday and Friday off. But next week, we'll be here Monday and Friday, not Wednesday. Okay. All right. So the Black Plague. I spent a considerable amount of time yesterday trying to find the clip that I used to use from Interview with a Vampire, so you all could see Lestat and Louis walking through London in the Black Plague, and could not find a clip. And it dawned on me last night at dinner. I'm talking to my wife, and I said, honestly, like I've spent an hour and a half trying to find a stupid clip that would work that I could show you all in class because I referenced it on Monday, and I can't find it. And it dawned on me that the reason why is because it's not important to the story, right? Like, oh, there's tons of other stuff that's important to the story or the movie, right? But this short, like, minute and a half clip that I used to use doesn't exist any longer. You'll have to watch the movie if you want to, okay? If that's something that you're interested in. But the Black Plague. So the Black Plague is interesting in that you get the bubonic plague from filth, right? It kind of trickles down through mostly rodents into insects and then into people. Okay, you get these large swellings about the size of an egg that generally grow in your groin or in your armpit. Okay, they ooze blood and pus, and they are extremely painful. Okay, extremely painful. You get a heavy cough and sweating with this. And every bodily fluid produces a foul smell, okay? So I said on Monday, this is where we get, right, Ring Around the Rosies, pocket full of posies, right? You have a pocket, people would stuff their pockets with flowers, with flower petals, so that the smell would, hopefully you wouldn't have that smell. But that's the idea. Okay. If anybody has seen the plague masks out of Italy with the long nose, right? Like eye holes and long nose, looks like a bird. Part of that was so that you could put smelling something that smelled nice in the end of that, so that you wouldn't have to smell people because it smelled so bad. Okay. I saw one yesterday as I was looking up everything that I could show you, but it was like a steampunk one, and I thought that was pretty cool. Anyway, I don't know. It was metal with like rivets, goggles. Anyway, you all don't care. So the plague, though, death within 4 to 5 days. So imagine you and your friends go out, right? You're here at CSI. You go out to a basketball game one night. You're all there. The next day, a buddy of yours isn't feeling great. And by day 3, he's dead or she's dead, right? And now all of a sudden you're not feeling great. And ultimately you're going to die. Like, there's not a way around this. I find it fascinating that we're talking about the plague right during a pandemic, because it's very similar in this idea that it moves so quickly and the death rate is higher. Now, obviously, COVID is not as high as the plague. The plague moves so fast, okay? So how did people in 12th century, 13th century Europe react to this? Well, first they blame the Jews. Okay, as usual, it's the Jews' fault. Jewish people took the brunt of a lot of this, and part of the problem and part of the reason why is because of this idea of them killing Jesus Christ, right? The problem with that is that there was a problem right after that has been an issue for a long time, and that is that their laws and customs, Jewish laws and customs, were different than Christians. And so, although it is this idea like, oh, well, you killed Jesus, so we don't like you, it actually doesn't have a lot to do with that. Okay, it does stem from their different cultures, customs, and culture that they had. But people start to believe that Jews were poisoning the water supply and practicing witchcraft, which is why they blame the Jews. Okay. Jews were massacred in cities along the Rhine. They were driven from their homes. They were burned to death by angry mobs in order to get the plague to stop. The problem is that the plague can't stop because you've got people going back and forth on the Silk Road, right? And so the plague is just running rampant. It starts in India, is where it starts, and it takes off from there into China and then across the Silk Road into Europe. I mean, everybody is feeling the effects of the plague. In India and in China, you get a quarter of the population that is dying. But when it hits Europe, a third of the population dies from the Black Plague. Okay. Now, much like today, right? You get COVID that comes out of China. It then spreads pretty quickly. Same with the Spanish flu, right? The idea with the Spanish flu, we call it the Spanish flu, but it was not from Spain. It actually originated with swine in Kansas, and several people got sick, transmitted it to other people who then went off to World War I, and it took off, especially in the barracks there, and then hit in Spain, and 8 million people contracted the flu, which is why we call it the Spanish flu. And then it came back across the Atlantic and ravaged the United States. Okay, that is the Spanish flu, right? 1918. With the plague, death is much more quick, right? 3 to 4 days. So there are some things that this is going to do. Authorities, human and divine law that ruled society are lost. Okay. Most of these people die or lock themselves in with their families, and many leaders move away from the cities into the countryside. Okay. So let's talk about that first. Cities are hit the hardest. There's a big reason why cities are hit the hardest is because people are living together, and so you can't get away from the plague, from these people that have contracted it, right? So you can't get away, you're packed in closer. It's obviously the way that it takes off in India and China, but as it crosses the Silk Road, you're missing people because there's not as many cities across there, right? But when it gets to Europe, there are a lot of cities, and so it takes off. The second piece about being in an urban society is that there isn't a lot of waste management. Okay, the roads are strewn with litter. There's not a sewer system, and so you're getting a lot of places where the plague can continue to feed off of things. Okay, cities are infected. People start leaving the cities and going to the country. And this is where you get social breakdown. So rural areas are not hit as hard, but some areas obviously are hit, which leaves then entire villages that have been killed or died due to the plague. And you have abandoned farms on the periphery. Nobody is working those farms, which means that you don't have the resources, right, going back into the cities. Whole families die, homes and properties are left unclaimed. You then begin to get a shortage of labor. We'll talk about labor in a minute, but this shortage of labor is going to lead to famine and inflation. Okay. At one point in time, landlords are freeing serfs at a pretty regular rate, but then the plague hits and landlords cannot free serfs because they need them to work because other people are dying and there's this labor shortage. This leads to peasant revolts. A couple big ones is 1358 and 1381. These peasant revolts in England. These revolts lead to more death, but not by the plague. However, it does transmit the plague as people are getting together, being in close proximity with one another. Okay. The high mortality rate seriously disrupts economic and social relationships. Okay. From a paper, this is a poem from a paper in, what is it, 1380. I had to laugh, the merchant said, the doctors purged and dosed and bled, and proved through solemn disputation the cause lay in some constellation. Then they began to die. First they sneezed, the merchant said, and then they turned the brightest red, begged for water, then fell back. With bulging eyes and face turned black, they waited for the flies. Okay, and there's several here that I mean, you can find them. That's one thing. I'm going to get there in a minute, but the art that comes out of the plague period, right? So these poems, what is this one? Okay, this one, the sickly season, the merchant said, the town I left was filled with dead, and everywhere these queer red flies crawled upon the corpses' eyes, eating them away. Fair make you sick, the merchant said. They crawled upon the wine and bread. Pale priests with oil and books, bulging eyes and crazy looks, dropping like the flies. Anyway, and I mean, these are poems that are in the paper. Okay. So everyone starts moving to the countryside. This is a breakdown of governmental structure. As you have a lot of the people that have money moving to the countryside, there isn't any law going on within the city any longer. And so the people who can't afford to leave are stuck there, but have no way of making wills, having any sort of government function at all, right? It just kind of seems like it's lawless at this point. European civilization also begins to expand because what you're getting is people leaving those cities and going out to the periphery, okay? There's less arable land and less farming because there's not a lot of people and a lack of labor or a labor shortage. And so famine starts to set in. The infrastructure wasn't set up to feed this population that's now living on the periphery, right? This was set up to feed the cities, and you had a lot more people that were out in the countryside who were taking care of all of your farming and your agriculture and feeding those cities. Now the cities have died off, and they died off early, pretty quickly. And so those people lost farms, they lost family members, they don't have a way to be able to feed that many people any longer. Not to mention that then climate change caused in the late 14th century a little ice age. This meant colder and wetter temperatures. This decreased crop yield. This also occurs while these people are heading out to the periphery. So on top of the plague, you start to get famine. I mean, it's like they can't win, right? Mongols begin disrupting trade routes from the east, which then leads to an economic depression. Debtors die, and creditors have no way of regaining the money that they had borrowed to those people. Most likely their entire families die, and so there's no way to collect payment. Building projects come to a complete stop and are abandoned. Craftsmen die and could not be replaced. This led to labor shortages. It also led to higher wages, which is great, but you can have higher wages when you don't have anybody to pay, right? So labor shortages, higher wages, this leads to inflation. I mean, honestly, this is just a great time in history, right? I mean, the plague, ravaging people, famine sets in, economic depression, climate change leads to an ice age. I mean, honestly, it's out of control. So let's look at some of the art. This is why I've shared my screen. I put this up on Canvas. I didn't have it for Monday. I wanted to have it today so you all could take a look. This is some of the art going on at this time. This is the Dance of the Black Death. This one is interesting. This is a four-piece here with this horse running through the middle with a skeleton on it, right? This is the plague running rampant through some of these areas. You can see some of the people here that are already dead. And then my favorite. This picture I've used for several years. I think that it's interesting in the amount of people who have died, are dying, right? Just everything that's going on in the world at this time, and this coffin right in the middle. Like, anyway, the Black Plague, not a great time in history, right? People become obsessed with death and death imagery during this time. So you get the poems that I read, you get the art that's coming out of it. Tomb sculptures depict death. They had, at one time, they'd been highly decorated and elaborate sarcophagi, right? And they would be betraying lords and ladies, angels, and then you start to get depictions of decomposed bodies being eaten by worms, draped in rags. Like, it just turns, right? It turns from we have this idyllic situation to now death, and everything has to do with death. It's just unfortunate. The plague has not really a permanent effect on politics at the time, but it does create this problem where you have people leaving the city and not having any government structure there. And so, although there isn't a permanent effect, there is this temporary effect where there isn't government and there isn't authority there. Okay. The 100 Years' War is suspended in 1348 due to the plague. Because many soldiers died of the plague. That's part of the reason. It gets restarted again. City councils are decimated. Many nobles and families die off. I mean, whole families die, right? The legal system closes down. Wills and business transactions cannot be completed. Okay. So let's talk about the plague in major terms that I want you to talk about in the exam next week or in the final. Okay. The plague is passed through the Silk Road, right? So you're going to want to talk about the Silk Road and how important the Silk Road is, especially to not only trade, but how it moves the plague back and forth, right? The plague coming out of India to China and then over, and it spreads into Europe and takes over. Okay. The plague leads to a labor shortage. That labor shortage leads to higher wages, which leads to inflation. Inflation, labor shortage leads to economic depression. Okay, so economic depression because of the plague, right? So if you are answering a test question, and we'll talk about this next week, but if you're answering a test question about the plague, these are major points of significance that you would want to talk about, right? People moving to the periphery. So moving to these rural areas, out of the cities into the rural areas, creates somewhat of a major problem for people, because now that you've got people moving to the periphery, you're not as connected, and because of the cities, which then causes famine to set in. You have a labor shortage, and you can't take care of the resources that were out there, which then double up, right? You've got depression, you've got the plague, now you've got famine setting in, things are not going great, on top of the structure that you had, which was some sort of government and religious structures that are now gone. Now, that doesn't mean that people are not practicing their religion, but they are doing it by themselves, right? Smaller parishes, maybe family run religious practices. You're not getting together with these larger groups any longer. Okay. Okay. Those would be the major things that I'd want to talk about in answering a question about the plague. Okay, let's go into a little bit deeper what that means for us, though. The plague, more people are migrating now out of Europe, out of city centers in Europe into the periphery, but also out of Europe itself or into Europe. And you start to get different ethnic and racial backgrounds coming together as people are trying to find spaces, green spaces that are farther apart from people. We start to see them getting ethnic and racial diversity happening in the periphery. This leads to racism. Okay. Now it's not based on skin color or descent. Rather, it's based on language, customs, and laws. Right. So as people move in, we start to see that other groups, specifically groups who have lived around similar people in the urban setting, move to a rural setting. And now you get, for instance, Muslims moving next door. And now you're like, well, wait a second. I don't want to live next door to this person. Like, this is not what I wanted. I want to go back to living in a Christian community. Or Muslims living in a Muslim community are now like, I didn't want to do this, right? But it has to do with language, not even necessarily religion. It's language, customs, and laws. Early in the time period, we had legal dualism, which existed so that people were allowed to keep their own laws and customs. So that when people moved in, their laws were set so that you could continue to practice your religion or your customs or whatever it might be. And the law saw it as dualism, right? They both could exist. I don't have a time period. Not that it matters because you wouldn't necessarily know it, but I think it's the 1400s. But in Spain, Muslims receive a guarantee of separate but equal judicial rights, legal protections under the law, right? And so we start to see these laws coming out that are allowing these groups to be separate but equal. There is a great exception, which is the treatment of the Irish in England. And this continues on. I mean, this continues on today, to be honest, but right into the 70s and 80s with the IRA. And you get a bunch of fighting that's going on, and the Irish feeling like that they're second-class citizens to the English, but the English continue to practice racial discrimination, especially with the Irish. The legal structure was set in place so the English could discriminate against the Irish. They were given access. The Irish were not given access to courts. They were not able to make wills. You could murder an Irishman without any repercussion. I mean, right? Like, okay. So, what's the broader implication here? As we start to see groups coming together and having to live next to one another, we start to see the rise of nationalism. We haven't seen nationalism prior to this period, okay? There hasn't been a point in time where you would be like, I'm English or I'm German, right? It was mostly I'm Christian. And prior to that, it was I'm Roman, but everybody wanted to be Roman. Or you were Han Chinese, well, everybody wanted to be Han Chinese. So there wasn't this like, I'm setting up a wall and you can't be a part of it, okay? On the contrary, the Han Dynasty wanted to take over more land, and they were more than happy to be able to continue to grow their empire, just like the Roman Empire, and make you Roman. But then we get into this period where people are coming together, and we start to see people saying, look, my language and customs are the right language and customs, and that's what we do here. Okay? So now you start to see people being like, well, wait a second, I'm English, you're not English. And it's this rise of nationalism, okay? Later in the Middle Ages, there's a change away from legal pluralism towards legal homogeneity. and an emphasis on blood descent, right? Meaning, hey, my family's been here for generations. Now, on Monday, I spent a considerable amount of time talking about this. I think that we sometimes we look at this and we think, well, I don't understand how that is. But let me give you a more contemporary idea of what this looks like. I don't know very many Californians moving into Idaho. Part of the reason, though, happens to be that I live in a small rural area. And do you know who we see displacing people from my rural area? Is people from Boise. People from Boise are moving into Wendell and then saying, well, I moved down here because so many Californians moved into Boise and I don't want to be up there anymore. Well, that's great. And I get that you're Idahoan, but you don't understand, these Boise people don't understand the way that we run things in my small little town. So then when they move in and they want to take over or they want to run for city council or whatever, the rest of us look at them, right? Like kind of give them the side eye, like, hey, wait a second here. You don't know how things run in this town. I'm giving you, I mean, this is all real, but this story is actually real. I have a friend who moved here several years ago, moved to Wendell, and she continually gets asked, why did you move here if you didn't have any family here? Which is true. We all are related to each other in Wendell. I legitimately, like I joke all the time that my wife and I had to get married because we're the only two that weren't related. But honestly, like that's the way that it is. So just think for a minute, if you're living, even here, if you're living in Twin or in Burley or wherever, think of those people that move in and the things that are said about people. And that's the exact same idea of nationalism that I'm talking about, that starts to come out of the plague, right? As people are moving around and are displaced, you start to see this rise of nationalism of people being like, well, I don't like that custom that you or your culture. I don't like that. I want to be around people that I feel comfortable with. Okay. We start to see the breakdown of traditions as people try to assimilate. We see nationalism and a desire to have a state that designates one language and one shared form of customs. One of the first happens to be the Bohemians. The Bohemians are filled with hostility towards Germany or Germans. They're not Germans, but it's the closest thing I can get you at the time, right? So this idea of like, we're Bohemian, you're German, and we don't like you, okay? We see guilds in different towns that passed laws that forbade apprenticeships of Slavic people. Okay, we start to see this rise of nationalism on a level that we had not seen it. Now, I asked the question on Monday, I'll ask it again. Is there a difference between patriotism and nationalism? Right? And I think there is, right? There is definitely like this idea of I am a patriot and I am proud to be for where I'm from. But there's also this idea of like, hey, a difference between I'm proud of my country and I'm the only one that can be here. Does that make sense? And I think that we need to understand that we don't see nationalism before this time, and then nationalism is what's going to lead us to World War II, right? Nationalism, it brings about the Ku Klux Klan. Nationalism, we're having problems with nationalism today, right? This isn't a problem that goes away. What's interesting is that it's sparked by the plague. I would argue it's sparked by the plague. Other historians, I think, would argue maybe something different. But most of the people, the historians that I associate with, would tell you that the plague sparks nationalism in the early period. Okay. nationalism doesn't have to do with anything with necessarily race. It has everything to do with customs and laws and the ways that you want to feel comfortable in your space. Okay. So if we're going back, you've got nationalism, you have the plague that is being pushed through the Silk Road. It creates the breakdown, a social breakdown in government, in familial structures being moved, people dying. It sparks inflation, labor shortages, which leads to economic depression. It leads to famine as the resources, you can't gather enough resources to feed the people that have moved to the periphery. And ultimately, my argument would be is that it leads to nationalism. Now, is this week 15? We're in week 15. You know that whatever you put down, if you can argue it in your exam question, that I'm going to give you points. I'm not looking for you to say, hey, Justin's right. He says this thing. That's not really my deal. So if you wanted to argue in a test question about the plague, if you wanted to argue that the plague didn't give rise to nationalism, that would be okay, as long as you backed it up, right? The plague, though, plays such a major part of global world history at this point in time, especially from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean in Asia and Europe. Right? We get some other things going on in Africa. The plague winds up in Northern Africa, not a lot in South Africa, but in Northern Africa and right around the Mediterranean. Like I said, it kills off 1/3 of the population. That's a lot of people. Okay. The plague doesn't hit the Americas. Instead, the Americas get other things that are similar to the plague. And if you read the chapter this week, you'll find out. Okay. Any questions today? Okay. So that is the plague. I'm going to stop sharing here. That is the plague. We're going to talk about the Reformation. Those are two big pieces, the two big things that to end the semester that we need to talk about. Okay. So on Friday, we'll talk about the Reformation. The Reformation is one of my favorite lectures to give. I think that it's fascinating and it has a tie to everything that you're doing today. Okay. And I will make that claim on Friday. We can talk about it. And then remember, next week, we're here Monday and we're here Friday, but the exam will be open Wednesday and it closes Sunday night. The hope is that you could get on and take the exam and then you would be finished with this final and you wouldn't have to deal with it over finals week. Okay. If you need an extension, let me know. We can do that as usual. I just don't want to push it. I can't push it any farther out than Wednesday at the latest, but I'm leaving it to Sunday night right now because I think that it's important for you all to be able to get on and do it before finals week. Okay. If there are no questions for me, you all are free to go. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon, and I will see you all on Friday to talk about the Reformation and Martin Luther, right? Super excited about that. All right. Take it easy. Good to see you guys on Zoom.
Thank you, Mr. Ripperman.
Yeah, thank you. See you all.